during every crisis in the last 155 years. Chronicle reporters are here. The experts on the front lines, telling the story of our city, adding perspective, sharing stories of bravery, compassion, and resilience. And we will be here to chronicle our city's recovery.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to Litquake 2020. My name is Jane Ganal. I'm the co-founder of Litquake. Tonight's event will be Tom Perrotta in conversation with Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa. It is not often that Litquake has 3 Oscar nominees in the house, but this is an unusual year. I don't need to tell you that. Many thanks to our 2 co-presenting sponsors tonight, SFFILM and San Francisco Chronicle. This year, Litquake is all virtual, streaming live from our homes in the Bay Area to points all around the world through October 24th. We know that you are exhausted by all the relentless stream of shenanigans coming out of Washington. So are we. And for that reason, we think this year Litquake might take on a bit more of importance, offering connection, humanity, inspiration, or at least a temporary escape and a few laughs. We want to thank everyone in the literary community who helps put this festival on, including our dozens of community partners, our very small staff, our donors, our board, and even those who bought a Litquake Jeopardy mug. Check that out on our website. As always, it's an amazing group effort, and we're very grateful. Before I introduce Tom, Ron, and Albert, a few notes of business. Please feel free to ask the participants a question by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We won't be able to get to all the questions, but we will certainly get to a few of them by the end of our time together, which will be about an hour and 15 minutes total. After the event, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey. We hope you'll take advantage of this. These surveys are essential to our future fundraising efforts. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can buy Tom's books from your favorite independent online bookseller or find our Litquake bookshelf at bookshop.org. That's a new thing for us this year. We also ask for your support of Litquake in general to help allow us to bring you these events for free. If you believe, as we do, that words and literature have the power to transform, please consider dropping us a few dollars. We accept donations on Venmo at Litquake, on PayPal at info@litquake, or directly at litquake.org. Enough of that, let's get on with the show. Fellas, do you want to come back on while I do your introductions? Fellas, I sound like a 40s dame. Tom Perrotta is both a best-selling author of 9 works of fiction and an Oscar-nominated screenwriter, whose credits include Election, Little Children, The Leftovers, which was adapted into a Peabody Award-winning HBO series, and Mrs. Fletcher, all of which were based on his books. His other books include Bad Haircut, The Wishbones, Joe College, The Abstinence Teacher, and 9 Inches. In addition to producing Election, which won the 2000 Independent Spirit Best Picture Award, Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa's producing credits include Cold Mountain, Little Children, and Best Picture Academy Award nominees Little Miss Sunshine and Nebraska. Berger and Yerxa were also co-executive producers on the adaptation of Perrotta's work, The Leftovers, and their recent films include Juliet Naked, which was fabulous, Peanut Butter Falcon, which I have not seen, and Blow the Man Down, which, seriously, write this down, Blow the Man Down. They were co-executive producers on it. It was absolutely amazing. And a new movie called The Last Shift, which I'm hoping will be in circulation at some point soon. They also produced some amazing music documentaries, including I Am Trying to Break Your Heart about Wilco, complete classic. Tonight, we are hoping to spend a little time talking about the movie Election, which Tom wrote and they produced, as a precursor to the big event coming up in a few weeks. I'm sure you've all seen Election, or you probably wouldn't be here tonight, but if not, Election is the very dark humored story of a young girl named Tracy Flick, who will stop at nothing to be president of Winwood High School, resulting in an election that is engulfed by sex scandals, smear campaigns, and behind-the-scenes power brokering. I don't know, it sounds kind of familiar to me. Anyway, without further ado, please welcome Tom, Ron, and Albert.
Thank you, Jane. Hi, Albert. Hi, Ron.
Hello.
I guess I'll start. First thing I want to just clarify is I wrote the novel Election. The screenplay was written by Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor, and it's an amazing screenplay. And let me also just take this moment to express my gratitude to Albert and Ron. You know, I think when you're a young novelist, what you hear often is just the nightmare stories from people who get their books optioned, and if they're lucky, and then a movie gets made, and almost invariably they would be depressed by the result or feel like some injustice had been done. And I instead had this, I think, kind of a fairy tale experience with Election, where there was this book of mine that was unpublished. And I got it to them through the good offices of a wonderful writer named Janice Shapiro, who heard me read from a different book at a writer's conference. And in a very short time, they were able to, get this project launched that turned into this movie that 20 years later, I think still really holds up, and I'm, really proud of. And I think often people will say, well, how do you, I've had a lot of books adapted, and they'll say, how do you get such good movies made? And I will say, I work with really good producers. And that's Albert and Ron, who I've worked with repeatedly. So I just wanted to take a moment to say that.
Yeah, well, we have to express the same to you, Tom. It's rare that you have one has a collaboration that has lasted as long as ours. And, we've worked together on a lot of your books, and it's kind of a dream come true for us to, be as close friends and get to collaborate with an author who we respect a lot and whose work is so cinematic. So this has been a wonderful ride for us, and we hope to continue with you until we're old and gray, although I already am. So, not to mention Ron.
Yeah, I'm just, I guess we're supposed to mute, although I didn't think we were to stay muted. But anyhow, am I muted or not? Oh, okay.
No, you're good.
Okay, good. I just unmuted. But yeah, I mean, whatever generosity came to us in those comments, Tom, we have a great debt to you and your work. I mean, it's been kind of the centerpiece of our work in a lot of ways. And Election, we often say, is our signature film. And to also have little children and leftovers, it's been, a great thing for us as producers and as friends. So it's amazing all the way around. I might have a little bit, I was explaining to Jane, for some reason, starting early this morning, I've been sneezing. There's a little catch in my throat, but I'm not sick. I just took oxygen test and thermometer test, and I have no symptoms of COVID. But I think I'm developed an allergy of sorts to isolation and loneliness, because I come in here every day, 7 days a week, and maybe it finally caught up with me. But if I have to...
I think we've established that we all like each other and that Ron is healthy, or more or less. So.
Okay, let's move on then.
I think we can sort of talk maybe a little bit chronologically about how Election happened. And, I think for me, I got really interested in the election of 1992. Part of it was I was unemployed that year, and I was just spending a lot of time following the election. But I also think I felt that, that sense that maybe we have this year also, just, it had been just a long era of Republican dominance. You had Reagan for 8 years, and then the first George Bush. So it had been a 12-year run of conservative dominance of American politics, and old school Cold War, 50s style American government. And here came Bill Clinton in 1992, and it did feel like a generational shift, but it also felt like his wife was a new character on the scene, and he almost immediately in the primaries brought this aura of sex scandal with him. And on the first page, I was just rereading the book, which I haven't looked at in quite a while. And on the first page, Mr. M says, the election that turned me into a car salesman took place in the spring of 1992, when Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill were still fresh in everyone's mind, and Jennifer Flowers was the momentary star of tabloids and talk shows. All year long, my junior current events class returned again and again to a single theme, what the media called the character issue. How are private virtue and public responsibility intertwined? Can you be an adulterer and a good president, a sexual pervert and an effective, impartial member of the judiciary? And I took that question, that was sort of the question of the Clinton era, and put it into this book that's set in high school, and really gave all of my characters this sort of public life and a private life, and it was the interplay of those things that kind of defined the story. And I was thinking about it today, and I do feel like Election was so much a book of the Clinton years, and one of the reasons the book and the film have lasted so long is that I think we've been living in the Clinton era right up to 2016, and even into the Me Too era. That whole period was sort of defined by the Clintons, by their marriage, by some of the questions that the sexual scandal that defined that presidency, injected into the American political discourse. Sorry, that's my lecture.
Well, Ron, you want to talk a little bit about how we came to the book?
Yeah, sure. It's a second delay there to unmute. Yeah, well, as Tom mentioned, we had a mutual friend. Maybe she's on the webinar. Who knows? Janice Shapiro, who is a writer, and she was at a writers retreat, I guess, on Tom.
Red Loaf. It's a writers conference.
Yeah, and she heard Tom read, I guess from the Wishbones, and she thought it was great. So she called us and said, I just got back from this, and there's really a great writer who has a sensibility that, she thought we'd really like. And so we called Tom, and he said he wasn't finished with that book, but there was one in a drawer that his agent and perhaps publisher too just felt was a hard one to get going. And so it had been, sitting there, and he'd be happy to send us that. And that was the manuscript for Election. So it was like great serendipity all the way around. You want to take it, Albert, while I sniffle?
Yeah, I mean, once we read the book, we really loved it. And it just so happened we had an upcoming meeting with MTV Films, and they were at Paramount. It was, they were making films, feature films. And we met with a guy, David Gale, who became a very good friend, but we told him about the book. David was very excited about it because he thought it would be a great way to explore the world of high school. He read it and loved the book as well. And so all of a sudden, David optioned the book from Tom. Tom was kind enough as producers to let us shop it for free, which was invaluable, particularly at that time when we had no resources. But David ended up optioning the book for MTV at Paramount, and thus began a kind of complicated process of, you know, trying to find the right writer and director for the project. And very early on, we had identified Alexander Payne. I'd gotten to go see an early rough cut of his first film, Citizen Ruth. And I had long admired his student film, The Passion of Martin, that he had done at UCLA. And we thought Alexander was a perfect choice for this, but Paramount was initially very reluctant. And we had to go through, you know, approaching some other directors before finally Citizen Ruth played at Sundance, and it was universally praised by the critics, and Paramount warmed to the idea of Alexander directing and Alexander and Jim Taylor writing it. So we set it up, you know, it was set up through MTV with Paramount. Alexander and Jim came on and began to develop the screenplay with us. And that was a complicated process because Paramount, you know, they were very interested in a kind of rockin' soundtrack and, you know, a teen film and all that. Alexander had a very different agenda, which was much more in line with the spirit of Tom's novel. And so it became you know, a question of Ron and I as producers trying to help protect this movie that Alexander and Jim were writing based on Tom's material as it went through the machinery of a big studio. And that started with screenplay development and carried out all the way through the release of the film. And, you know, as producers, it was by and large our job to push the misunderstandings back as far as we could into the process. Paramount was very determined to make a PG-13 movie. Anyone who reads Tom's novel or read Alexander's script knew it was impossible as anything but R-rated, and that it had, you know, very little to do with a rockin' soundtrack and, you know, fun-loving teen experience, that this was really what happens behind the curtain with teachers and their, you know, their sort of animosity towards their students and rivalry and students' ambition and all of that kind of stuff. So this kind of dialectic played out all the way through the process.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one thing I'll say right from the start is I remember there just being a discussion of, you know, here's this book. It's hard to say who the main character is. Like, I think now when we look at the movie, everybody says, oh, you know, it's Tracy's story. But I think if you read the book, and I think it's fair to say in the movie too, you know, it's both Mr. M's story and it's Tracy's story. But, you know, Tammy is a really important character. Paul is. Ultimately, in the book, there are 7 narrators, and it's a short novel. And I remember there just being this discussion early on of like, the screenwriters are going to have to choose, is this Mr. M's story? Is it, you know, the kid's story? If it is, which kid? And Alexander and Jim, I think to their great credit, said it's everybody's story. And they, you know, came up with, you know, I think this just really remarkable script because, you know, that kind of trading off of first person voiceover is I think it's pretty unique. I mean, maybe there are other films that do that, but it's hard to think of what they are offhand.
No, I think we really embraced the whole voiceover concept, and it really was laid out in the novel. But I would say that, you know, Jim, that Matthew Broderick's character is the main character. It's just that, you know, he's so passive aggressive and self-deluded that it's, you know, he doesn't come across as straightforward and direct as Tracy. And she, you know, her raw ambition really, you know, is very powerful in the movie. And, you know, she certainly makes her play for the center of the story. But I think, you know, the story very much starts with Jim and ends with Jim and, you know, really is about his downfall in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, Ron, do you want to add anything there? Or?
Well, you know, I think in general, what's unique and why election has stayed in everyone's mind in the way it has is it defies a lot of the expectations of the genre in terms of the ambiguity and complexity. So even as you're talking about who's really the lead character, it's not clear like who is the antagonist and the protagonist or who's good and bad. Each character has a mix of traits that allow a lot of interpretations over time of how the story really plays out. And I think it's now 21 years, but people who see the film can see a lot of different things in it because of its complexity. And it just, even as you were talking about it, it's really rich in the character interaction and the motivations. And so it goes into a very familiar genre and then subverts it by the complexity and ambiguity of the characters and story.
Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, even recently, A.O. Scott in the New York Times wrote a whole essay about how, seen in the past, Tracy was the villain of the story, but now through a kind of modern prism, she's the hero of the story. And it's so funny. I mean, when people talk about Tracy Flick, often it's in derogatory terms. But, we had an intern not long ago who would proudly say, Tracy Flick is my personal hero, so it's a character that is very rich. I mean, for me, I love Jim. I love Matthew Broderick's character because he's so human, it's, he's obviously very troubled and confused and, is even misleading himself, but ultimately, I recognize, and I think that's the brilliance of this film, is that it recognizes the humanity in all these characters. I think Alexander often said, I love all of them as many warts are on display. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, well, the point you're making, Albert, it shows how rich and robust the kind of interpretations are, because I remembered A.O. Scott really went overboard with his revisionist view of the film and kind of stood it on its head, where I think he calls Jim a monster, and he's a very complex character. And I think to turn it 180 degrees, even though he wanted to, I guess, readjust to something in the zeitgeist, really missed how, that in varying ways, they all have these qualities that are positive and unfortunate or despicable or great, but they're all mixed together. It's a very, very rich, complex, situation and character. So what you say about Jim, I felt a lot of, sympathy for his position as a teacher, being sort of run over in a lot of ways. And of course he does, kind of awful things within the story, but he's not a one-dimensional character by any means.
Yeah, well, I think this has been the most interesting thing about having written a story that has, been kind of in the public conversation for about 20 years, because I think you can really measure the way that our culture has changed, and I think early on, there was just a kind of, I think, very, male-centric sense that Tracy was a kind of a villain because she was just this incredibly ambitious, fierce young woman, and Jim is scared of her. And let me just, I think it's useful for me to just tell you, like, where that Jim's story came from, because it's partly where the book came from. Part of the book just came from the 1992 election, which had three candidates, Clinton, Bush, and Ross Perot. And Tammy is kind of the Ross Perot figure. And, Paul and Tracy are kind of the major party candidates. But the other thing it came from was a story that I happened to read in the paper, which was about a high school principal who was the kind of old school religious guy, and he discovered that his students had elected a pregnant girl as prom queen. And I think, I didn't know a lot about the story. It was just, there was no internet in those days. It was just like I saw a 2-paragraph story in the Times, or, but I had a sense that the students did not do this to say, hey, isn't it cool our friend got pregnant? It was much more like a kind of touching send-off. Like they understood, like their friend was pregnant, she was having a baby, she was going to be an adult very soon. And to make her prom queen was kind of like, I thought, like a sweet tribute. But in the way that I think a lot of morality was, contextualized in those days, there was just a sense that we cannot set that example. We can't be rewarding a girl who had premarital sex. And so the principal he tampered with the election. He set the votes on fire and said, we can't have a prom queen this year because the votes burned. And there was, fire alarms went off in the school gym, and the fire department came and they had to do an arson investigation. And they realized that the only person who could have burned these votes was the principal, and he ended up losing his job. And I remember having this like very complicated reaction to this story, the first being, that's so stupid to, try and deprive these kids of this nice gesture that they were trying to do for their friend. And also, I had this thing that now is just a regular part of our political life, right? Which is we have a president who is intent on, kind of, what's the right word? I mean, he wants to destroy this election. He wants to tamper with it. He's already saying it's rigged. He's setting up all kinds of challenges. He's trying to deprive people of the right to vote. But I had this feeling reading this article of just like, there's something sacred about an election. I know there've been lots of, political dark deeds in our nation's history, some around elections, et cetera. But I did have this feeling inside of me that I was surprised by, because I thought I was a cynical observer of American politics. Like, you can't tamper with an election. Like, that's a sacred thing. And I realized, like, I actually had this belief in me. Like, I didn't believe in God, but I believed in elections. And then the fiction writer in me said, okay, this is an unthinkable thing to like undo an election, to tamper with an election. So let me see if I can write a character who does that. And I didn't want to just satirize some religious person who was a hypocrite, And I tried to think, like, what if I were this guy? Like, what would make somebody like me do something that I thought was morally unthinkable? And I think I started from this idea of, friendship might do that. And there's some sense of, Jim is close friends with Dave. He's Dave Novotny in the movie, but not Dave Novotny in the book, because Alexander gave the characters much more fun names than I gave them. Yes, there he is. I started there, and that story of Tracy and Dave's affair kind of came out. And that was sort of where it started, was like, what would make a good man do an unthinkable thing? And that's often like at the heart of a lot of my fiction. What would make a good person do something that violates their own moral code? Because it happens all the time, and it's those moments that, are real moments of character revelation. It's like you do the thing that makes you who you are, that changes the course of your life. And so that was sort of where I started with Jim McAllister.
It's funny because when you talk about the ritual of the election and how sacred it is and all that, I remember, the sequences in the movie where they're marching down the hall with the ballot box, or where Tracy is putting her vote in the thing, and then the photographer takes her picture of her putting it in the ballot, and all of the pomp and circumstance music that is playing. It really is, both showcasing that ritual in a high school context, but also, very effectively satirizing it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I went to the set only for that one weekend, or it wasn't a weekend, but I went to the set for a couple of days, and that was the scene that was shot. And I remember watching you know, Reese putting her vote in the ballot box and then turning to get her picture taken in that, you know, and that was such a revelation, right? I mean, we can't talk about election without talking about her performance and the way that she was just such a live wire. And I remember just being like jolted by the energy that was coming out of her as this character of Tracy Flick. I think, you know, it's such an iconic role now. And I remember just on the set, you know, seeing her in her little skirt and turtleneck sweater, and she just had that posture, you know, and that deeply expressive face. And I had a sense that I was in the presence of something really pretty remarkable.
Yeah, well, she was the first person that Alexander met in casting as far as for that role. And he immediately thought, oh my God, she's perfect. And I think she really had a plan for how she was going to play this part. You know, certainly it's interesting how different that character was in the book, you know, to the movie. And in a lot of ways, Reese brought, and I say this in a positive way, a kind of almost cartoon-like approach to that performance and that character. You know, I remember your character in the book was equally interesting, perhaps more complicated in some ways. You know, I remember there was something really raw and something really self-knowing about her, and something very sexual about her too. Whereas Reese, you know, was like, it was just all about the ambition. And, you know, she just had an approach, a unique approach. So, I mean, the casting in the movie was quite interesting all around. I mean, Chris Klein, was actually a wrestler at a high school that we were scouting. And Alexander was walking down the hall and saw Chris walking towards him and said, who is that guy? You know, and ended up auditioning him and casting him. Matthew was a sort of late-breaking choice. I mean, the studio wanted us to cast either Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks, or we used to joke anyone named Tom. And it was a long process of going through the big stars of the day to finally getting to Matthew, who the studio, liked and we liked as well. Ironically, Alexander had never seen Ferris Bueller. And I think that particular role was the very reason why the studio wanted to cast him. You know, there's something, very youthful and, winning about him, although, the character really is very much in another direction. And so it's that sort of, the idea of the eternal, youngster that where something has started to corrode and gone rotten or something. And he played that beautifully. So, and then of course, Jessica Campbell was a, complete fresh face. And by the way, it's interesting the way you mentioned Ross Perot. And I mean, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of heroic qualities about Jessica. I mean, she's really, the rebel and the free spirit and the person who's sort of making her own way in the world. And a lot to say about her as well. Her character, Tammy.
Yeah. One of the reasons I think the movie has taken on different meanings over the years is that I think people like to play a sort of parlor game of who do these characters remind you of, because they're sort of American political types. And what struck me, I had this very simplistic, really all I thought was Tammy is Ross Perot. The other two are, like obvious major party politicians, but, they're high school students. They don't really have, political programs that attach to conservative or liberal or anything like that. But then Alexander went further, right? And I remember that he was not looking, he saw Tracy very specifically as Nixonian. He said Tracy is Richard Nixon. but then I think in the early 2000s, people started, there was that viral video that really was set up Tracy as Hillary Clinton and Paul as Barack Obama. And so she went from being, you know, generic, ambitious politician to Richard Nixon to Hillary Clinton. And then I think the real sea change that's happened in the past few years, and it wasn't just the A.O. Scott article in the Times, but I think Rebecca Traister also wrote a piece about this. You know, she becomes like Monica Lewinsky in a sense, you know, and this idea of Tracy not as some precocious, ambitious, older than her years politician, but Tracy as a teenage girl who is, you know, sexually abused by a teacher, that Tracy is, you know, Tracy as victim. And what's interesting about that is Tracy herself does not want to see herself as a victim. But I think that the big change in this sort of Me Too era is that it's, you know, that narrative didn't exist really in Tracy's mind for herself. She wanted to see herself as an agent, as somebody in charge of her life, as somebody who made a choice, you know, that the boys in her school were not, you know, in her league. They were just too young and insubstantial that she thought she wanted to have an affair with an older man. But I think now we just look at that and, you know, we see a different narrative. We see the narrative of an older man taking advantage of a vulnerable young woman. And Tracy doesn't see herself as vulnerable, but I think we do now. And I think that's changed people's interpretation of the meaning of election and the meaning of Tracy's story. And I do think it's all there. You know, I don't think the way the movie is told or the way the book is written denies that reality, but I think we see it much more clearly now just because we're looking through a different cultural lens. And I will say, even in the you know, the movie, you know, Tracy is very wounded in the course of the story, and I really love that Reese found those moments, you know, the moment like with her mother after the election. You just see like all the pain and all the vulnerability and just her youth, you know, in a way that sometimes is obscured by the energy and power that's coming out of that character.
It's probably a good time to talk about the original ending in the book and the movie, because it sort of ties into all of this in a way. You know, do you want to describe how the book ended? Because of course that's how the movie used to end.
Yeah. So the movie was filmed with a faithful version of the book's ending. And it basically, like the film ending, it jumps ahead a year. Mr. M has lost his job and he's at loose ends, and a former student who likes him recruits him to work as a car salesman at his father's car lot. And so Jim is in there, you know, and he's really conscious of like, I have screwed up my life and now I'm, you know, have been knocked down a couple pegs and I have to, you know, rebuild. And he's in the car lot, in the car dealership, and Tracy shows up and she's kind of making him suffer a little bit. And she makes him go out on a test drive of a car. But when they are in the car, they start to talk in a way that actually feels real. It's like they've both kind of grown a lot and suffered a lot as a result of the election mess, as they say. And Tracy really tries to get Mr. M to explain like why he did what he did. And I think Mr. M has real shame and a real desire to be forgiven. And they end up driving to Tracy's house, and she gets her yearbook and gives it to him to sign it. That's a still from the original ending. And that's how it ends. You know, he writes, "Dear Tracy," and you don't know what's going to come next. Is it "I'm sorry," or is it some kind of long explanation? And I think what happened Well, I mean, Ron, maybe you can describe what happened once we shot this this
Well, the
version.
one thing I would add first is that it all takes place in front of her house, and you know, the camera pulls back as he writes "Dear Tracy," and you see this, you know, grain silo in the background, and she lives in this dumpy little house, and you know, there's a kind of a sense of, you know, where she came from, in a sense that these two characters at the end of the day share something in common, more in common than with anybody else in the story, with all they've gone through. So there was something very heartbreaking and poetic about this ending. But Ron, take it away as far as what we ended up doing.
Yeah, well, it's curious because some people really love that ending. And I think it poetically was great, but it was very subtle because what Alberts is describing as far as the house and the grain silo, you know, the house, I don't know if it was dumpy. I mean, it was just a modest house. You had to, I guess, extrapolate in your own mind that there's a recognition that they didn't have previously, that they're both from a certain socioeconomic class that is not, you know, the powerful. It's not like Paul Metzler, whose father has a cement company and can buy him new trucks. So Tracy has some awareness throughout the story that you know, she's not you know, a privileged child of money. Her mother is you know, ambitious for her and gives her a lot of guidance, and you know, obviously, you know, wants her to succeed. So she has that as support, maybe too much support, but she is on a different, I guess, level. And so that Jim and Tracy, that moment of signing the yearbook, it's almost, I don't know, a very subtle, poetic European ending. But for whatever the merits were, which, as I say, for some people were very considerable, there was an idea that it was somewhat vague or inconclusive, and the studio wanted to see, in a way, Jim doing something, teaching again. They were looking for some kind of satisfying, sort of happy ending. And so it took a year to go through a lot of different ideas. And then a year later, you know, we picked it up and shot in New York, so that I guess everything from the moment that he's driving the car and the student spits on his car, then cuts to New York, where Jim has a kind of minimal life. He's in a lousy basement apartment, and he finally got a job at the Natural History Museum guiding what seemed to be kind of, you know, low-level tours of student groups. Anyhow, you know, I'm, I think, a big proponent of how perfectly this all worked out, because when that character then goes on a vacation, seemingly by himself, to DC, and is just doing the tourist things, when he sees Tracy get in a limo, come out to get in a limo, and he does this great interior monologue about, you know, what's she doing, but she must be miserable in this life. And I forget the exact dialogue here, but you know, that
Who the fuck does she think she is?
no, but that's at the end. You cut to the end. He's kind of saying, I kind of forgive the whole thing. You know, she's probably not that happy in the life, you know, but that kind of whatever largesse toward her is undermined by the anger and the resentment he has towards the whole thing. And that's where he goes to, who the fuck does she think she is? And throws, you know, a malt at the limo as it drives away. So I don't know, Albert, Tom, take it away, but I thought that was a very rich thing for Jim McAllister to be thinking about, whether his life has gone to shit and hers hasn't, or whether he has this grievance toward her, and indeed he does.
Yeah,
So,
for me, I always thought that I like the original ending because it suggested that people have the capacity to change and grow. And we used to joke that this was the first time we've ever heard of a studio insisting on a more cynical ending, that people are fundamentally who they are and nothing's going to change. In the end, you know, Jim is still tormented by her, and there's that little girl raising her hand, and you know, you get this kind of road runner, Wile E. Coyote dynamic that for all of eternity, these two characters are going to be, you know, haunting each other in some way.
well, you know, I don't know, maybe that's right, but I kind of remember it a different way where the studio wanted to see him back on his feet teaching. And
Well,
we
they
went
did,
through,
but they also wanted humor too.
well, maybe, but
Yeah.
I don't remember them wanting a cynical ending. They thought, you know, in a weird way, when the studio person said, we love both these characters, we want to see them happy. I thought our relation to those characters is much more complex than that we love them and we want
love
to
them,
see
yeah.
them.
You know, it's funny. I'll be the one to say, like, I like the ending that I wrote for the book, but I think the ending that is on the movie now is better. I think it's because it's more tonally connected to the movie that Alexander Payne made. I think it's a really faithful adaptation of the book, except that he turned the satire up 2 or 3 notches. And I think when you do that, characters get a little bit flattened. You know, satire wants, you know, slightly flatter characters, and I remember that one of the things that I had a few conversations with Matthew Broderick, and he said that neither he nor Reese really believed that original ending, that they had grown and that they had learned to sort of see things from the other person's point of view, that Jim had developed empathy for Tracy and that Tracy had developed empathy for Jim. Matthew was just saying, like I still hated her. And I think the ending that we came up with after that year, you know, that Alexander and Jim came up with, does capture that sense that, you know, Jim hasn't grown, that the animosity toward Tracy is still burning inside of him.
Well, a couple of things I just want to add about that ending. For one, the year delay really had to do with Matthew Broderick being in the movie Godzilla and us having to wait until he was done in order to you know, film again. Although it was Reese's idea, thinking of Clinton and Lewinsky, that, you know, her character had moved to Washington or was living in Washington working as an intern for a politician. But also, I just have to point out that the main impulse for Paramount to want to change the ending of Election was because of the test scores, which were very weak for the original version of the movie. I remember they were 51, which is very weak. But then we did the reshoot and everything, and we tested it again, and it ended up scoring 51. So, you know, it just goes to show you that I think everybody feels that the ending is just right that exists now. But for those of us who had a kind of fondness for the original ending, it stays in our consciousness and haunts us to some degree. And I think you see it work in a lot of Alexander Payne's endings since then, in Sideways and Nebraska, where he managed to, I think, grow in a way where he could pull off this emotional ending. Whereas in his earlier work, like Election and Citizen Ruth, there's a much more cynical ending. But I see Jane is here, and hi, Jane.
I'm here because there's some really good questions in the question queue, and I thought for maybe our remaining 20-25 minutes, I could read some of them off and you guys reply to them. Most of them are about election. Somebody Litquake knows very well, Elise Prue. I read Bad Haircut as a galley when I was a baby agent in the 90s and immediately realized I was reading a big new voice. I've been a fan of Tom since, but I have a question. The first time I watched the film Election, I thought Mr. M was the protagonist and Tracy Flick was the antagonist, but I just rewatched it and realized the opposite is true. I would just like to get a reaction to that realization. And you did talk about this a little bit earlier, how maybe because history has shifted a little bit, that maybe the way we look at these characters has shifted a little.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been the most interesting thing is to see the way that this story is a kind of litmus test for the viewer. I think that, and I'm implicated in this. I was writing it, in the early 90s, and I know, it's just when you're a writer, you just kind of follow your instincts, I think, in terms of what it is that catches your eye. And I remember, I had gone from like a public high school, working class public high school to Yale as an undergrad. And then I spent the next, 15 years in academia. I was at Syracuse for grad school, and then I was teaching at Yale, and then I was teaching at Harvard. And what I was seeing was this new generation of incredibly ambitious and powerful young women. And they just weren't people that I had seen growing up, like most of the adult women in the town where I grew up were not people who went to work, and they weren't doing, aside from being teachers, they weren't doing like really high powered things in the world. And I had the sense that like there was just this new breed of girl and young woman in the world, and that they were very threatening to men, and I think that has obviously played out. You saw it in this debate with Pence and Kamala Harris just the other night. There are still, many, many men who just feel like that woman can't talk to me like that, who still have just this sense of their, that male entitlement, and I could see the threat, that someone like Tracy posed to that sense of male entitlement. And that's kind of the drama at the heart of the story. And I think maybe early on, viewers and readers maybe were just assuming the point of view of the threatened male. It's just kind of a really interesting thing. Albert mentioned this before too. I over the years have run into so many women who will just say to me, like, I was Tracy Flick. And they don't say it like that's a bad thing. They just see in her, like, I know what it's like to be a young woman and to feel like I have to excel at everything to prove myself to the world because the world is viewing me with some skepticism. And I do think that what the questioner is discussing is true. I think now we're a little bit more able to see the story from the point of view of the ambitious young woman who's being objectified and stymied and silenced.
Although let's not grant her sainthood just yet. I mean, I remember watching CNN during the last election, Hillary running against Trump, and I turned on CNN one day, and there she was, Tracy Flick. It was Kayleigh McEnany, and I just was horrified. I mean, all of it, seemed to, and I understood Mr. M's desire to, way back when, to try and stop her. And, she keeps coming. I mean, now she's, there she is as the White House, press secretary. And it's, you can't stop her. I mean, so there's, it's multifaceted, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point that I think, it's wrong for people to feel like Tracy isn't entitled to power. It's also wrong to assume that Tracy's going to get power and do good things with it. It's like, I think Tracy wants power the way that a lot of men want power. It's better to have power than not to have power. And she just feels it in herself, like I'm able to lead. I should lead. I have that. I've anointed myself a leader, and I want the world to recognize that.
So this question is somewhat related in that Aaron Jones says that in his audio commentary for Election, Payne says there were some scenes that he had to cut that were in the novel, and also that he de-emphasized some of Tracy Flick's sexuality, which is interesting. What was the experience of the differences between script and novel in that sense? Is that your, do you believe?
I'm trying to think of some of the things that were cut out. I mean, I remember that we actually followed Dave Novotny and Tracy into the bedroom, and you saw the beginnings of a sex scene, and the camera moved in on a gigantic pimple on Dave's back, which we correctly cut out of the movie. But it certainly was not playing up the sexuality. But I'm trying to think what was cut from the movie, some of the scenes.
You know, I remember seeing dailies that were just hilarious. This comes out of the book. It's, you know, Jim and his wife are trying to have a baby, and their sex has become very, you know, kind of laborious and dictated by the calendar. And Jim, to perform, has to, like, you know, psych himself up with some porn. And there's just a hilarious scene of, like, Matthew getting himself ready to have sex by watching this terrible porn down in his basement, and then, you know, rushing upstairs while he was still able to get it up. And I remember that sort of didn't survive. But I think in the larger
watching porn does, but in a different, you know, it's sort of, that's when he realizes Coke and Pepsi, and he comes up with the idea for Paul.
Yeah. So some of that is still in there. But I think the larger thing is, you know, Tracy in the book was feeling, you know, was thinking about sexuality also as a means toward power. Like, she knew that she was sexy, and she felt able to control that power, you know. And I think part of the story is that she wasn't as able to control it as she thought she was. You know, I've been thinking about this lately, just because, you know, it's so clear to everyone now in a way that maybe in the early 90s it wasn't, you know, just this question of, can a girl that age have sexual agency? And Tracy in the book really thinks that she can. And it reminded me, well, I thought about her when I saw that amazing Marielle Heller movie, Diary of a Teenage Girl, which was also set in the 70s, and she has an affair with her mother's boyfriend. And there's just, you know, just clear, like, that she thinks that she's in control of it. And when you watch the affair play out, that does seem to be the case. Like, he is ruined and she's empowered, you know. And it's a very different narrative and sense of sexual agency than I think we're comfortable with right now. But that was an available narrative of the sexual revolution at that time. And I think we've rejected it now, but I think it was in play for a while. And when a narrative is in play, I think people can embrace it in their lives.
Question that's actually about little children and election. The two books that I've read are Election and Little Children, where adults are always being impulsive and giving into their more selfish impulses the way children do. What do you think the great pitfalls or tragedy of adulthood are in the modern age, where adults are encouraged to act immaturely and children are often seen as wiser, basically? That's a very heavy, meaty question. So.
Yeah, well, I can start by just saying, you know, this has been kind of the one pretty much constant through line through a lot of my work is this sense that we never leave high school. You know, that America is high school. That a lot of us in adulthood, you know, like the Freudian model is we're all trying to, like, deal with some wound that we suffered in early childhood, but my feeling is we're all trying to, like, deal with some wound that we suffered in high school. And I do think there's something funny about, I think for a lot of us, you know, young kids now are so, they're like, in some ways, they're like super kids. You know, they do so much more than we did, and they seem so, like, just so kind of far advanced and more controlled than I think maybe we were when we were young. There's some some feeling sometimes like these kids are like more mature than the generation of their parents. So there's some of that, but I think that's just my sense of you know, adulthood is just being this fictional state that most of us are not really mature, responsible adults. We just pretend to be them.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting in both the Prom King, you know, Paul in Election and Patrick Wilson in Little Children. And, you know, the kind of arrested male is certainly a character that flows through your work at times. And, you know, certainly is in evidence in both of those movies.
Yeah, well, it's amazing, right? I mean, one of the things about Trump is like he's not even arrested in high school. He feels often like a junior high kid. He has like that level of self-control. And actually, I think it's part of his political power is that people just like remember like, oh, that was the bully who like ruled the playground, and somehow he seems to have a natural right to rule rule the world, you know?
It might even go further back, you know, all those New Yorker covers of him, you know, as a baby jumping into the swimming pool, or, you know, he's like a gigantic baby, you know, with his desires that need to be fed instantly, you know. So anyway, not to go off.
Well, you know, that's one of the things that I was thinking was, you know, Election is this Clinton era story, and I think it's had legs all through the past 20 years because that was like the kind of a Clinton era that sort of ended partly with the election of 2016. Like if a country elects Donald Trump, there's no more sense that a character matters, right? We've just decided like that's not the point. You don't have to be good to have power in this country. And maybe people never were, you know. I think John F. Kennedy was sainted, and then after he died, it was clear like, wow, this guy had lived quite a life while he was in the White House. But we paid lip service to character and to virtue. And with Trump, that went out the window. It's just like, that doesn't matter. You can be the worst person in the world and you can still get elected president. That's clear now. But then I think there was some frustration because, you know, when that Access Hollywood tape came out and Trump revealed himself to be this like nightmarish guy, so you just grab him by the pussy. Hillary was a little bit silenced in terms of fighting him because Bill had done some things that were, you know, quite shameful as president too, you know, and she was like the very wrong person there to confront Trump from a moral place. But I think, you know, then in the Me Too era was this kind of explosion of frustration that like we have this guy who's like bragging about abusing women and he's somehow our president now. And it was, I think, a real sense of we need to make it clear like this is our sexual standard now, you know, and that ended kind of the Clinton era, I think, which was so tangled up with the sexual revolution and sexual politics and gender politics. I think we're in a different place now. But Election was a part of, I think, that larger story.
There's a question about The Leftovers, which you all worked on. This person says, I adored the series, but never got the chance to read the book. My question is, what was the origin of that story? What was the inspiration that caused you to write it? And then also, my own personal question is, there must have been a huge difference for you to work together as a team on The Leftovers, which was this ongoing series that went quite a long time, and just a one-shot movie. I mean, that must be an entirely different ballgame.
Yeah, so the origin of The Leftovers, like most of my books, has a kind of usually has a 2 or 3 seeds. One was that I had done a lot of research into evangelical Christian theology while I was writing The Abstinence Teacher, and I started thinking a lot about the rapture and what a poetic image that was of, people just leaving the earth en masse, and I didn't believe it, but it also seemed like such a powerful image of, sudden absence. And I had experience with that. My dad, actually 18 years ago this week, died in a car accident. And I think, I was just grappling with that idea of sudden loss. And I just kind of used the rapture as a way to discuss that in a kind of grand scale, I think. But those were it was a book about grief, and they're using the rapture, but not in a kind of Orthodox Christian way to express grief. And yeah, I think working on TV and film is very different. The writers really control the TV production process. I think it's a very different thing. Like when Albert and Ron produce a movie, they're involved in every phase of it,
Yeah, on The Leftovers, Damon Lindelof was the showrunner, and worked very closely with Tom, and they created the whole thing. And we were, Ron and I are primarily film producers, and on that particular project, we were very enthusiastic cheerleaders, but not as involved in, day-to-day things. So it's a different process. And, we look forward to experiencing more of that with Tom on other things and more films with Tom. So keep working quickly, Tom.
Yeah, God, it takes so long to write all those words.
Yeah.
Jane, just jumping back for a second to election, and we got to a certain point in the story, of the ending and the film coming out. But even after that was resolved, of shooting quite a bit of additional footage, through the end, the studio had no belief in the film. They didn't know what to do with it. It was like, this is neither fish nor fowl. It's not, a high school good time. It's not, anything that we had in mind. And they couldn't come up with marketing materials, and it looked like it might go straight to video. And there was no energy and money to make a big release of the film. We were kind of saved by Sherry Lansing, who was head of Paramount at that time, because when she learned from us that there just was not any support for the film, she turned it around quickly. But I'm saying that partly in that it's San Francisco and Litquake and all that. One of your colleagues asked before we got on, was there a anniversary celebration for election, which there really wasn't, even though it was 20 years last year. But it brings back our fondness for the Smith San Rafael Film Center, because when there was no entity wanting to have a premiere, and in fact at a certain time, Paramount just said, you're on your own. Mark Fishkin came down and saw the film, and they were so down on the film that it kind of seeped into our bloodstream too. And like, really, is it that unreleasable? We didn't think so. But then Mark saw it at Paramount and said he'd like to make it the opening night of the film center. And I almost thought, really? Because we've gotten a lot of reservations, but he stuck to it. And it was, we were all there, I guess, 21 years ago. And, it's really a fantastic event, and closed down the street and opened up the center. So that is the gratitude we have to San Francisco, Mill Valley, and the Film Center, because they saved us and made a kind of great celebration out of the film.
Oh, that's a great story. And it's a classic now. So I just can't believe that there was so little support. But I guess, best among any of us that Hollywood likes its things in neat silos. You know, it's a comedy or it's a drama, or it's a high school this, or it's an adult that. So I can see how it kind of got stuck between silos.
And it was a movie that was ahead of its time, and I think that's part of why it continues to feel fresh. I think one of the reasons they didn't know what to do with it was that it didn't fit. You know, like this idea of an R-rated teen movie that basically was like, we killed the R-rated teen movie because Election did so poorly in the box office for quite a while. It wasn't until, I guess, American Pie, which was a very different sort of, you know, kind of gross out comedy, you know, revive that idea. But MTV was like, we're never gonna do that again.
But, you know, the truth is that the critics really love the movie, and you know, a lot of thanks to them, because had it not been for the great critical response, you know, it wouldn't have, you know, gone beyond the 25 theaters that it opened on. But all of a sudden, Paramount thought maybe we do have something, even though we didn't quite understand it. And you know, it got a big enough release that it was able to carry forward. So,
I think we are just about to the end of our time. There's a few questions I apologize I didn't get to, but I want to thank you folks so profoundly for coming to Litquake. And Tom, it was great to have you back. I think the last time Tom was at Litquake was to celebrate a big award for Tobias Wolff, who was, I think, your mentor at one point. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah. So thrilled to be part of that. Toby's a great writer and a great teacher and a wonderful man. So
ironically, Ron and I got our start because we had convinced Toby Wolff to give us an option on This Boy's Life.
Oh.
That was our very first project, and unfortunately we weren't able to see that through, but that certainly, I mean, Tom studied with Toby, right? And you know, he was the first guy to sort of give us a shot as producers. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the full story, which is that when we heard Tom was going to come on, I wrote to Toby and said, would you be interested in doing a Zoom event with them? And he said, I don't know how to do that stuff. I don't want to do that stuff. Thanks anyway. I'm like, talk about old school.
yeah.
Anyway, but thank you so much. And please, everybody who is with us tonight, fill out the surveys if you get it in the email, and donate to Litquake, and keep reading and keep watching fabulous films. And again, blow the man down. You won't be sorry. Watch this movie. Thank you all for coming tonight, and pick Flick. Pick Flick.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.